Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Masterclass from Print podcast. I'm Barbara Rowlands, I'm the Committee of Women in Journalism, and I'd like to welcome Francesca Specter. Wave, yeah, there you are. So Francesca, she founded the platform on podcast Alonement in 2019, which was the inspiration for her book, Alonement, How to Be Alone and Absolutely Own It, which was the 2021 Times Self-Help Book of the Year. So she's going to demystify everything about podcasts. And I just want to mention, she also runs a 5-week online course as well. And she'll probably tell you about that later on. So we've only got an hour, so it's very tight. And obviously do put your questions in the chat, and Francesca will answer those at the end. So over to you, Francesca. Okay.
Thank you, Barbara, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming and for spending the first portion of your Thursday evening with me to learn about podcasting. And I'm going to do this talk specifically from the vantage point of a journalist talking to journalists who I didn't ever have podcast training. I didn't have a background in podcasting. And yet podcasting was sort of the thing that went on to underpin my career and gave me a platform, gave me a very important platform to take me from my traditional journalism training forward into what then became a platform and a book deal. So a little bit more, I think Barbara has explained all this in the introduction already, but I'm the author of a self-help book called Alonement, which is about the time you spend alone and making that into quality time. And because I think that you can't be what you can't see, I also host the podcast Alonement, which is now in its 6th season. And on that, I interview my guests about the time that they spend by themselves in order to give different views of what that might look like for different people. And then late last year, I went on to found a podcasting course for journalists who, like myself, wanted to go on to launch their own podcast independently with no prior experience about a topic that they found as interesting as I find alone time. And previous to that, I was an editor at Yahoo Lifestyle, and at this point I have over a decade of experience in lifestyle journalism. A little bit about the podcast. So it's 6 seasons in. I've had over 200,000 downloads. I have a listen through rate of 89%, which is pretty good as an industry standard. And I've had the absolute honour of interviewing over 50 high-profile guests, including Alain De Botton, Felicity Cloak, and Vic Hope. Alonement has also been featured in all the publications I have wanted to write for as a journalist as well. And it's been amazing in allowing me to sort of streamline now what I write about day to day and be the way that I've almost got my unique brand within journalism as well. Now, through this masterclass, I won't even endeavour to try and scratch the surface of what I talk about in my 5-week course, or everything that I've learned over the past 2.5 years of podcasting. But what I will hope to do is to demystify what the process involves, because I think that quite often we think that we have to, if we started as journalists, we only have one string to our bow, or maybe a couple, the writing and the interviewing part. And I want to say, as someone who has done it all myself, that it is possible, and I want to show what that would involve if that were to be a route that I'm sure that many of you listening to this would be interested in going down. I'm then going to move on to an introduction to my 5-step podcast launch process and how I break that down. And finally, a little bit more about how podcasting can benefit you uniquely as a journalist, particularly bearing in mind some of the skill sets that we all share as journalists. To begin with, I just wanted to say as well, to stress that I had a background that was very much similar to probably a lot of people listening to this to some degree. You know, I worked for a number of lifestyle publications across print and digital. At the time, this was fairly early on in my career. I didn't have many industry contacts. I didn't have a social media presence. I know that often when people launch podcasts these days, it can be with a lot of social media followers, and that can be daunting because it can seem like a barrier to entry, but that wasn't something that I had. I simply had a passion for a subject that got people talking. The reason I knew Alonement would make a good podcast was simply because every time I brought it up with people, they had a story of their own to tell, which was something that convinced me. You know, I was also very lucky to have an MA in magazine journalism. I was taught by Barbara, who introduced me just now, but I also had zero podcasting experience. My journey involved, in the summer of 2019, I found myself actually starting by writing a book proposal, but not quite knowing what would launch me and what would give me a platform to be able to talk about this and sort of sell myself as a business case for someone who would write a book, because as I said, I had no social media presence, none of that. I started podcasting as a hobby in my spare time in 2019. By 2020, I'd launched a podcast, and by 2021, that was what led to my book deal. So it was, although a long process, it was a process which I do think was able to accelerate me towards that. Enough about me. Podcasting. I want to talk about how that looks from the outset when you begin, and some of the barriers to entry that we might face as journalists, as writers, as creatives with no technical background, because it is a total minefield. When you think about podcasting, you might think about all the things that are involved. So that might begin with just seem like an amorphous mass. But when you break it down, it still seems overwhelming. It's booking guests, it's interviewing people, it's marketing, it's distribution on different platforms like Apple and Spotify. It's the production side, it's the editing, it's the social media, it's the setting up the equipment, it's the graphics of making the podcast artwork and the social media graphics, it's the scripting, it's the branding, it's the creative decision making. What jingle do you want to go beforehand? All of that, it can seem like so many things. And I remember starting out, even though I knew that this was something that I'd seen a couple of other journalists do, I definitely thought at first, you know, how was that possible? How is it possible to encompass so many skill sets that I just don't have as a journalist? This is actually what then led me to, after 2 years into my podcasting journey, to develop a course specifically around that for journalists, so podcast to platform, to break it down. And this is the course that's going to inspire the format I'll explain today in terms of the 5-step process. But before that, these are the principles that got me through, and these are the things that I want to bear in mind when it comes to good podcasting. To begin with, it's simply about mastering the technical basics. You might be listening to this thinking, look, if I'm ever going to launch a podcast, I'm not editing it. But I think that whether you choose to do that, and that is actually a choice that I've chosen to make thus far, to edit my own podcast, even if it's something you don't choose to do, it's really good to know how, and just to get a bit of a background how, because then when you hand it over to someone to edit, you know what to tell them to do, and it's a much easier conversation to have. I think the other thing when you're starting, it's like any marketing product, the same with when you are doing a book proposal, it's all about nailing down your concept, because then that makes the whole process, in my experience, a lot easier, whether it comes down to choosing what colours go on your artwork, to how long your episodes should be. And then it simply comes down to making a decision and sticking to it. Podcasting, more than anything I've done before, was a process that just involved so many decisions, so much more it seemed than, I don't know, when even, feature writing was a background for me. And while that's taxing in its own way, it didn't seem to have so many different elements to it as podcasting does. It was just simply quite overwhelming. So I think that realizing, especially for podcasting, which is a medium that's in its infancy, there are quite rarely right objective decisions. It really is just what you decide for yourself. And again, that can be something like, how long should I make my episode? What should the format be? The rules at this stage of podcasting, which is an industry still in its infancy, is that there are no rules. And I found that actually it was having that confidence and building that confidence, that actually just making any decision and getting the process ticking along, that was really key to my podcasting journey. I think also something that I think it's important to work on is establishing a streamlined workflow. So, as I say, all these things can be overwhelming when you're starting an episode, sourcing your guest and booking them in, and deciding what day of the week you're going to be recording your podcast or editing your podcast. Streamlining that process, it's all about getting the right process in, because that makes it easier and easier as you go along. And then finally, it's just remembering all the reasons that we go into journalism in the same way. It's having fun and staying curious, because I think that it can be very easy to get bogged down in the technical aspects of this. But I think remembering as a journalist that these are just hoops that you have to jump through to do something which is a really special process. That was really, really key to me, remembering to have fun, and to come back to the fact that, it might feel a bit boring having to set up the equipment and having to sit there editing, but at the heart of this is just a facility to have really, really good, inspiring conversations that you can share with the world. A little bit more about my process. So that sort of amorphous mass that I spoke about before, with all the different elements of podcasting, they can be roughly broken down into 5 steps. So the beginning step is branding your podcast, and that's things like working out what your artwork looks like. So that's the square that it shows up on the Apple Store. Working out what the jingle is, so that's the tune, the music that plays before your podcast. It's everything from how long your episodes are. Is it, do you want to make it a bite-sized format? Do you want to make it a Joe Rogan-esque, very long conversation? It's coming down to that and working out, what's your unique offering. And also questions like, is your podcast going to be something that is educational? Is it inspirational? What is the purpose of your podcast? And finally, I think the key for me is also the listener. Which listener are you appealing to? There's a certain amount of marketing that comes through at this stage. It's a bit like starting your own magazine or newspaper at this stage. You really are trying to think who the ultimate reader, listener is. It's all the same. But that is the absolute fundamental thing that makes the later decisions come a lot more easily. And I think because I think at the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed like every man and his dog had a podcast, and you sort of might as well just start a podcast. But I think taking that process really slow, and I will say that took me about 6 months. A lot of it was, obviously I've written my book proposal, so they were sort of one and the same, but a lot of it was thinking, who is my listener? What is this podcast for? What's my mission with this? But it made it a lot easier. And even, I'll admit to you, I'm painfully on brand. I think that, early on we decided that Alonement, my podcast cover, would be inspired by the image of a lone sunflower that was standing up against a bright blue sky. And, you'll see I'm currently wearing blue. My backdrop's all yellow. My book ended up being inspired by my podcast cover. It's blue and yellow. Everything is sort of on brand at this point, but it makes things a bit more streamlined, and it means that I always think back to that process, that that central image of a optimistic, bright yellow flower, that's a kind of a happy sort of solitary but also celebratory image against an elemental blue sky. So yeah, I think that is a really key stage, and that's the whole first week of my podcasting course. We sit and we ask those questions, and that can be, obviously it involves other people, but it also involves a lot of working out why you're doing it for yourself, because podcasting can be a very solitary hobby, and I think it's actually working out those things and you know how what your message is, and not getting that skewed by other people, that can be really, really beneficial at the at the later stages. The next thing is setting up your home studio. So I actually have my mic over here. So it's setting up. Effectively, you'll want something like I have this lovely dynamic mic that I got for about 70 quid off Amazon. I will say I got a much cheaper one early on and bitterly regretted it. But yeah, and it's you get a little thing called a pop shield, costs £5, sort of just make sure that there aren't any abrasive popping sounds that come out when you're recording. But it's a fairly cost efficient setup compared to something like video filming rather. And then it's just about thinking about your space. So I record my podcast. I sometimes film it too, in a very big drafty room, unfortunately, which is just the space that I have. But a lot of the process for that week of the podcasting course is really talking about what your unique setup is. Sometimes there might be noises in the background, and it's making sure that you're recording at the quietest time possible. To get over the fact that my space is quite echoey. You can't see this, but I actually pile up lots and lots of cushions and blankets on the table behind me. It's quite unglamorous stuff, but it's actually just working out how to make that environment best. Because another thing that I sort of advocate on my course is that prevention is definitely better than cure. You want to make sure you've got the perfect recording environment, or as good as you can, to make sure that you're not doing lots of editing or giving lots of work to your editor at a later stage. The third week is then around planning your show. So that's things like drawing on the inspiration of your branding and your unique sort of purpose with your podcast, all of that. Things like episode length. How long do you want them to be? How do you want the introduction to the show to sound? Some people have a blanket introduction that their podcast starts in the same way. Hello, welcome to the Alonement podcast, the podcast about time alone and why it matters. I'm your host, Francesca Specter. That would be just the same thing again and again. Some people prefer a slightly more informal beginning to their podcast, where they just sort of start talking, and it's like having a conversation with a friend. All of these decisions are what comes into planning your show at that stage. And then it's things like, what kind of guests do you want on? Are you just going to interview one guest? Is it going to be a solo podcast process? Are you going to have different experts that come on? Again, the rules are that there are no rules. I've seen really amazing things done with new podcasts cropping up all the time. And if you can sort of reinvent the wheel at this point, then it's quite exciting. I've seen actually a trend at the moment for bite-sized podcast episodes of about 10 minutes, but also a sort of middle ground now of 20-minute episodes. And actually, you might think, oh, I'm doing it wrong, or this isn't how my favorite podcaster does it. But actually, experimenting with formats can be really beneficial. So all of those questions. Then the fourth week is that slightly gnarly recording and editing stage, and that it is complicated, and that will be probably inevitably the biggest hurdle when you're approaching it as a journalist. However, there are different tools. There's actually something brilliant called Dscript, which is a very new software I've only started using in the past 6 months, which it's effectively a transcription software, but for podcasters. So it means, it's actually amazing. It means you can actually edit your podcast as if it were a piece of text, and you can make cuts that way. And that's completely revolutionized the podcasting industry for people coming to it from a journalistic background. And that's Dscript, Descript, Dscript. And that sort of thing is, it's innovating all the time, this industry. So that's been really amazing for a lot of journalists that I've spoken to that do also have their own podcasts. And then the fifth week, we talk about distribution and social, which is in a nutshell, how to get your podcast on Apple and Spotify, and then how to spread the word on social media, how to shout about it. So I'm just going to go through those in a little bit more detail than I have already, because that was just more of a quick overview. So podcast branding, in a nutshell, what makes a good podcast brand? Because there are lots of different things that go into it, and again, elements that I certainly can speak for myself, coming from a journalistic background, I didn't even know to consider. So this is, you might be a bit confused because my podcast is not called What the Flock. This is actually, when I'm talking to my students at the podcast platform, I always use the sort of fictional example of a bird watching podcast, which is not something I actually have an interest in myself, although, who knows one day. But it's an example, I use it as a mock-up for sort of how you can sort of create a particular podcast aimed at a particular demographic that you might not necessarily know everything about already. So here we go. This is my fake podcast cover, What the Flock. And this is actually something that I created myself on, and I'm sure quite a few of you listening already use this, on a application called Canva. That's spelled Canva. So this was me I think I mocked this up in about 5 minutes during a demo on the course, but it's basically showing that you can make your own podcast cover. So another thing that you don't necessarily have to outsource. There are all sorts of internet tools to be able to sort of DIY as an independent podcaster. But yeah, this is, this stage is effectively asking yourself what makes a good podcast brand. So of course, a clear primary listener, and this does, this has similar skill sets to when you're tailoring your features, your pieces to a clear reader. But you're also asking yourself slightly different questions as well on top of that, like, where is my primary listener listening to the podcast? There's actually quite a big proportion of podcast listeners listen while they're doing housework. I can definitely speak for myself that, if I'm sort of tidying around my flat, that a podcast, I sort of need that as my fuel to carry on. So it's good to sort of remember. And then sometimes people will be listening in the car. There are certain podcasts maybe tailored towards a family that people might be actually not listening to through headphones. They might be listening to in the car with their family, or sort of round the kitchen table. And then there are podcasts that people listen to maybe when they're running. So I think for some reason I quite like listening to a personal development podcast, something a bit more kind of health and wellness focused when I'm on a run. I think asking yourself those questions, that's good for building up a clear picture of your primary listener, because then that can inform decisions later on, like how long is the episode going to be, something like that. I know that when I started my podcast Alonement, I figured, and bear in mind this was pre-pandemic, but I figured a lot of people would be listening on their commute. So mine were about 45 minutes long, because I thought, well, people will be listening to them on the train. All falls on me, actually, because that was obviously not considering what was going to happen with the pandemic and work from home culture. But that is how long my podcast episodes have continued to be. And then also things like, the eye-catching visual aspects. I personally think, less is more. I think that if you can, as I've done, pick a couple of colours that work well for your podcast, and then use that consistently across all your branding. And sort of, I think it's important to also, it's really actually quite empowering to know your weaknesses, or, your limitations with this. I knew that I'm not a graphic designer, but if I was just working with a very simple color scheme, then at least I'd be able to signal my brand across social mediums, across all of that, across as it happens, I now literally wear my podcast colors every day. I pretty much dress solely in off-white, blue and yellow, which I'm not suggesting anyone else does that. It is a bit absurd, but it definitely makes life easier when I'm promoting a book and a podcast, quite a lot of the time. But yeah, I think the other thing, and this is sort of my top tip for when you're launching your podcast brand, is to make sure you've got a catchy, unique name that you feel good about. I think if you're going to get one thing right, you can change the podcast cover. I'm currently in my third iteration of my podcast cover. 6 seasons in, but 3 covers in. So you can change that. And you can change different elements. You can experiment with different lengths. But the really important thing is that you get a catchy, unique name that seems right for you, because that's the thing that's going to rank on Google. That's the thing that's going to be remembered by, the big podcasting platforms like Apple, and like Spotify. And yeah, I think I know one example of someone who's changed their podcasting name, but that was done, as I understand it, because they needed to separate themselves from the certain production company they had making their podcast. So yeah, if you're going to really spend time on something, then make sure it's the name. I also think if you want to go down a path to what I've done, or if you're kind of hoping to maybe turn a podcast into a book, or another brand extension one day, then having a name that you think can be consistent across both of those is really important. And then also I think there's maybe a trend to I think there's a podcast called Britpod, or I think there was a few podcasts which have something like cast in them or pod in them, like shortened version of podcast, or indeed the so and so podcast. I made the decision not to do that because I think it can limit you. So yeah, those are a few considerations when you're choosing your podcast name. Don't include the word podcast. Keep it to sort of 4, I would say 3 or 4 words or less, and make it something you can live with. And also, worth saying, because I know this might be true of some people listening, if you already have a platform, if you already have an established social media presence or something like that, then do consider making it the same, because there's no point in sort of reinventing the wheel if this is going to be across something you've established already. As it happened for me, I didn't have an established following, so I simply named my podcast Alonement because that's what I knew I wanted my book to be called. But yeah, it can come really handy for sort of that brand recognition. And finally, the thing that comes into all of this is having a defined concept and purpose. It's like a good features pitch. There's so many overlaps with the things we do every day as journalists. If you can have a really good tagline that you can sum up in a sentence, for me, Alonement is the podcast about time spent alone and why it matters. Another way of saying it would be, it's the podcast about the positive side of spending time alone. But it really is summed up, that idea of something that's celebratory, that's something that's positive, something that's taking a concept that formerly might have been seen in a negative light and making it a positive. It's as simple as that has informed everything I've done, from my very catchy, bouncy theme tune, to my sunflower, happy, celebratory inspired cover. And having all of that has really been quite useful for just making decisions a bit faster. I mentioned earlier that you have to make a lot of decisions when it comes to podcasting, and anything you can do to streamline that process is really helpful. So even if it does take you, as it did for me, 6 months to muse on your idea and make sure that it's right for you and something that you want to then spend a lot of time with, then I think that is probably where you can put your best investment of time, early on, getting that right. And finally, I'm going to do for each of these stages my sort of top tip. If I can say one thing, it's knowing your listener. So think about that demographic. How old are they? What do their professional lives look like, or personal lives look like? Are they male or female, or is it a mixed sort of gender demographic? Are they in education? Are they not? Where do they hang out? What do they do? This not only is useful for creating your podcast, but also, further on down the line, if you're looking for sponsors, or for, partnerships or whatever, it can be really useful for getting sponsors on board, having that demographic clear in your head. Similarly, for choosing guests, if you can say, well, would my listener want to listen to this podcast guest, then it can be very streamlining to your decision-making process. So definitely knowing your listener in the same way that you'd know your reader is a very useful thing to have early on. Next stage is getting technical. So there are sort of two stages on the technical side, but this is the prevention is better than cure side of things, when you're making sure that you eliminate any potential mistakes that you can make. Pre-production stage. So this involves things like sound checking. So what I do before I record every podcast episode is I get my microphone set up, I get my headphones set up, preferably at least an hour before the actual interview takes place, so I'm not stressing last minute. And then I record a bit of audio straight into my software, which is I use a software called Audacity, which is the sort of open source free software a lot of podcasters use. So I just record, a minute or so, just to make sure that my audio sounds okay, that my equipment's set up properly. But believe you me, that 5 minutes saves me a lot of time, because, God forbid, I got that wrong and I didn't have my microphone plugged in, say, or something like that. Then that could be hours and hours of editing or re-recording or whatever. So yeah, crucial stage. And then it's mastering your equipment. I think that, it's actually as important as it is to get a good microphone that you're happy to work with. It's also making sure it works properly and you know how to use it. Even case in point, the microphone that I have now is something called a dynamic mic. So that's something that I actually need to be about an inch in front of, so it works properly. Bear in mind, this isn't plugged in, but I'm just showing you for demonstration purposes. And then I use this sort of pop shield in front of it because it's quite sensitive, so it can pick up quite easily on sounds. But then there are different types of mics. Another type of mic in the industry that's very popular is something called a Yeti mic, and that actually needs to be used far away. So, something I really stress to the people that do my course is that, you can buy a really expensive mic and you can totally make a mistake if you use it the wrong way. So making sure that you've worked that out for yourself and not just relied on the strength of the equipment is really important. The next thing, I spoke about this a bit earlier, putting together your home studio, just being honest with yourself. For instance, I hate to admit I only got this fixed last week, but I spent 2 seasons of recording my podcast with a dripping tap, which was not ideal, but it's when you're doing something from home, you sort of, you have all the usual problems that you tend to ignore in your home environment. So I had a sandwich bag taped over my tap as a sort of crucial pre-production process with my home studio. But we all have things like that, we all have sort of, struggling to think of examples now. We all have maybe a very loud, noisy fridge that we need to make sure isn't rattling when we're recording, or a washing machine that can be noisy if it's turned on, or something like that. So it's making sure that all those elements are eliminated. It sounds banal, but it can save you so much time editing, and it can really make the difference from sounding, making your home studio sound like something that's quite professional, and something where you have a sort of homely sound blighting it all the time. And then, another thing is optimizing your audio, which is a fancy way of saying just making sure your mic is turned up to the right volume. For instance, my lovely Rode mic that I use, for some reason it only really works if it's turned up to 90%. So that was a learning curve. Purchasing the right equipment. So that's another stage. Something which, if you're doing my course, I'll talk you through, or you can ask fellow podcasters. I think that, a lot of this pre-production stage is really just being able to ask the questions and saying, I'm not silly if I don't know this. And also knowing sometimes that there's an overwhelming amount of information about podcasting on the internet. And I can tell you not all of it is accurate or even very helpful. So being able to ask a friend or a fellow, podcaster in the industry, or to be able to do a course is quite useful. The other pre-production stage is writing a brief for your guests. So for instance, I send something out, it's just a short sort of, A4 page, but I send it out to people ahead of time to say, please, for instance, wear wired headphones when you're recording the podcast, at the other end, because I record my podcasts remotely with guests. And not to get too into the technicalities, but if they're not wearing headphones, then there can be this awful feedback sound. So generally the industry standard is to use wired headphones that are plugged into your computer to record your episodes. But things like that, and just making sure that ahead of the time that you recorded your podcast, they're aware of that. And I just use the same document that I send out to, my last 50 guests have all received the same boring sort of checklist. But again, saves time, saves awkwardness at the start of the episode, and even things that you wouldn't think of necessarily, but you learn from experience, like if your guest is wearing jangly earrings, which if they're wearing headphones then bang up against the headphones, that can be an issue. So it's just making sure that everyone's briefed. That's effectively what that involves. Sounds like a lot, but once you've done it a few times, it all just comes second nature. This is effectively, just to give you an idea of what this involves, sound checking. That's 5 minutes of checking that your audio sounds okay from your end, 5 minutes of checking with your guests when they're on the Zoom. Mastering new equipment, you only need to play around with it once. That's, maybe a half an hour session working out how to make sure, what your equipment responds to best, and reading the instructions, which I'm not very good at, but I really can help. Putting together your home studio, again, this is just, I have a box of cushions I just plonk on my table whenever I'm recording a podcast, and then they go back away into the cupboard. Optimizing your audio, just making sure you've got the right mic volume, purchasing the right equipment. You only need to do that once. And briefing your guests, that's an email that you send out, a blanket email you send out to every podcast guest. So yeah, as complex as this sounds, it's not actually that hard in practice. Finally, top tip, not all about your equipment, it's how you use it. I think that's something I didn't quite get when I was first throwing money at my first sort of expensive mic and still wondering why the audio wasn't sounding quite right. I think that, if you can take the time initially to make sure you're properly using your mic and it sounds okay, and even being able to ask a friend to maybe do a quick sound check with you over Zoom, that can save you oodles of time and also just really boost your confidence early on around the technical aspects of podcasting. Planning your show, so just a little bit about what this involves. I think we touched on it a bit with the branding of a podcast, but this involves just making lots and lots of decisions, like for instance deciding on your release schedule. So a podcast can be released in a rolling format, so you'll see some brilliant podcasters who manage to release a podcast every week or every month in a rolling format. Examples of that, some of my favorite podcasters, Emma Gannon, who does the Control Alt Delete podcast, that comes out pretty much every week, and that's really amazing to keep that momentum up, and obviously a big way to underpin success and to keep on people's minds all the time. Personally, I prefer a seasonal approach. So my podcast comes out in seasons. I'm currently on the 6th, and the seasons tends to be 10 episodes long, and that allows me to do something which is called episode banking. So I'll record 10, I'll record at least, I have a rule with myself, I'll record at least 7, so the majority of the podcast season before it comes out. Losing my voice there, I need to just have a sip of water. You'd think I'd be used to talking a lot with all the podcasting. Anyway, yeah, so to avoid a heart attack, I prefer a seasonal approach. And my podcast, I'll record the episodes, I'll bank them, I'll do it like a month or 2 months before the season comes out. And then I know that I'll always have something to release. And then my release schedule, I like to do it weekly. Again, the rules are there are no rules. You can do it every 2 weeks, every month, every day. I forget the name, but there's a very popular podcaster who, is it Tim Ferriss? One of the American podcasters, he just releases his every day. And I think that's insane. I don't know how he does it, but that's, according to him, the only way that he sort of keeps the momentum up for himself. So the rules are there are no rules, whatever works for you. Deciding your episode length. As I say, mine have always been about 45 minutes because of that initial decision to keep it to a commutable length, which, you know, hopefully should pay dividends now people are finally commuting again 2 years on. But yeah, you can do 10-minute episodes, you can do 20-minute episodes. This also might depend on who you're catering to. Say your main demographic are, I don't know, 10-year-olds with short attention spans. 10-minute episodes can work very well. And then again, if you're discussing, if your podcast is sort of a very in-depth discussion about something, or, you know, even a sort of, you know, a sort of emotive conversation, then something like a, you know, an hour long, you know, an hour and a half long conversation, if people are absorbed, maybe, you know, maybe that's something that actually they can't get enough of, and that's a really good way to have that sort of sense of authenticity and not feel too clipped. It really is, again, what suits your genre and suits the kind of podcast that your vision is informing. Researching and booking guests. I'll be honest, this has got easier as time goes on. Now that Alonement is a fairly established platform, it's easier. I sort of have contact with publishers. Quite often I'll speak to, you know, people who are bringing books out, that kind of thing. Again, it really, you know, it's harder early on. I think the benefit as journalists we have sometimes is contacts. So as much as you can, I think drawing on people in the industry that you may have interviewed before or may have met before can be really useful if you have that option. I think, you know, also if you are doing a more specialist topic, take the example of bird watching. There aren't many bird watching podcasts, so that can be a really great niche. I think if you have a niche sometimes, and even if these people are, you know, big experts who are very busy, if you can offer them something rare, that you can offer an expert a rare opportunity to have a conversation about something they're really passionate about, then sometimes they'll say yes simply for the love of it. So I think it's remembering that sort of sense of fun and curiosity that I spoke to early on, it does work both sides. And, you know, your podcast can be a really great platform for someone else to come and speak. Then show planning, you know, involves something like writing your blanket introduction. So say if you introduce your podcast in the same way every time, or you're, you know, in the same, you sort of give the same summary every time, writing those. It can be also scripting your podcast. So maybe you introduce your guest and you want to give them a shining introduction. It can be writing those scripts. Finding your jingle, the theme tune for your episode, and finally, you know, structuring your episodes. My episodes follow roughly a format of a snippet of the conversation, my introduction for the guest, and then the conversation, and then I do a quick summary. Again, many different ways to structure your podcast, whatever suits you. Some people like little drop-in conversations with experts. Some people go, you know, straight into the interview and just sort of introduce their guest while the guest is on the call. Whatever works for you, but that's what this planning stage involves. Top tip, yeah. So I really have been impressed by the diversity of different episode lengths that I've seen recently. I think people are being brave and sort of, you know, experimenting. So I think, you know, there really is scope for, you know, even 5-minute podcasts now. I'd be really interested and encouraging to see people experimenting with different styles. recording and editing. I'm going to summarize this quite quickly because I realize we are coming towards question time. But to break it down, editing is probably the trickiest stage, but it can involve things like taking out the background noise from your podcast. So if there's a sort of a low hum from, I don't know, from an errant fridge or a radiator or something in the background, the software can quite often take that out, or take the bulk of that out of its a consistent sound. So it's learning to do things like that. It's normalizing the sound levels so that you and your guest sound about the same. And this can particularly be important if you're both recording over Zoom, and one of you has your volume turned up a bit louder, or one of you is using a louder mic, or whatever. It's making sure they sound the same so that the person listening doesn't have to turn the track up and down. And then editing, quite often when we think about that, it's cutting out unwanted material. I tend not to do as much of that as I used to, because I kind of think, well, we want this to sound like a natural conversation. But of course, if someone has a coughing fit when they're talking to you, or if you have a coughing fit, or you fluff up a question, the nice thing is that with editing, you can take that out. It's not like something like live radio. And then the tip that I give to all my podcasters is to make a punch list. And this is simply, as you're going through your conversation, if say you fluff up a question, or if there's, say, as you're doing your interview, there's something you want to take out, it's simply noting down, 10 minutes in, coughing fit or whatever. And it just can save you so much time, listening back and forth to the episode later on. And it's giving yourself a second to do that while you're recording. Can be really useful as an independent podcaster. It was definitely the thing that saved me so much time later on in my podcasting journey. The final thing, distribution and social. In a nutshell, just to explain, so podcasting, it involves hosting on a certain site. So you will have heard of Acast. So it will involve uploading every episode to a central site where your podcast lives, which is kind of like your podcasting website. And then that hosting platform distributes it independently to Apple, Spotify, Google. And the good news is everyone can be on Spotify, everyone can be on Apple. It's not hard to get on that. It's nice because it's quite a democratic process. It's not like, being verified on Twitter or something. It really is straightforwardly, everyone can exist on those platforms. But the confusion that people get sometimes is between something like Acast and Podbean, which is simply a site that you pay maybe £10 a month to, and then they can host your podcast for you. And then something like Spotify, Apple. So yeah, that's just another classic demystification that we go through on the course. And then finally, social media. There are 100 different ways to do social media, and there are 100 different ways to promote a podcast on social media. But one thing I particularly recommend to the people in my course, and to other podcasters, is Audiograms. And so you will have seen these. These are simply still images overlaid with a moving caption. And increasingly, they're really easy to produce. Acast, for instance, creates a really good tool to create them. With most social platforms pivoting to video at the moment, this is a really great visual way to promote a podcast, and to also focus on the wordy bit, which as journalists is sort of what we'll be fixated on. So yeah, my top social media tip is to use Audiograms. Just quickly, I wanted to say just how podcasting can benefit journalists, and why it's been so important to me. So podcasting is natural networking. I've met 50 people through doing this podcast in the industry, many of them with much bigger profiles than me, much more experience. And it's been great. It's been a great way simply to make friends in the industry. And, as a result, I've really been able to, speak on panels and, be much more involved and much more spokesperson through raising my own profile as well, in quite an organic way. You know, it's actually in some ways quite a nice, intimate way to get over the fear of something like networking. It's also evergreen material you can own and reuse, and I think that makes a difference to something like Instagram, where you're like, it feels a bit bitty sometimes. The algorithm can just mean that you're not seen, whereas podcasting just exists there, and you can, for me it was really useful when I was writing my book, because I could bring out these interviews. It also connects you to the real world, which is really nice. I think that sometimes it can be very easy to be, definitely for me, I find, journalism can be sometimes a solitary profession if you're freelance or if you're working from home. So podcasting is a really great means to instigate conversations. And it's also just been a really stimulating activity. I'm writing a topic which can sometimes feel a bit insular. It's about being alone, but actually through having these incredible conversations with experts, with celebrities, with household names, it's been something that's kept my ideas fresh. And it's really, it's a wonderfully two-way street. I think it's the thing that's really underpins my career, and actually the thing that, I think it wasn't just a means to an end of writing the book. It was actually the thing that I think took me through it. And finally, I just wanted to give everyone a bit more confidence in terms of what can make a journalist, a natural podcaster, because it's something that, it includes writing ability, it includes all the things that we know how to do, the scripting, the social, the show notes. It involves interviewing skills, which we all have, having a natural curiosity. Many brands I know will start podcasts, but actually, it's hard to actually have that journalistic curiosity if you're going from a marketing perspective, whereas journalists can seem like quite natural, authentic, curious people. Also, if you've got an existing focus or an interest area, as many of us already have, because that's the niche that we'll write about, then that can be a really great way to focus and decide on your podcast topic. Also, I think I mentioned sometimes if we have a solitary job and we're looking for connection, podcasting can be a really great way to serve that. Finally, for anyone who wants me to go in depth about the topics I've discussed, I run Podcast Platform. That's a 5-week course specifically for journalists, writers, and other creative people wanting to launch an interview-based podcast show. It involves weekly group workshops, how-to videos, downloadable PDFs that you can look at in your own time. And I'll be relaunching the course in April. So visit podcast2platform.com if you want to sign up, join the waiting list, and I'll let you know as soon as the course dates launch. So finally, we've got a little bit of time for questions. I've seen the chat filling up with a few. So I would love to, over to you. What would you like me to answer?
Do you want to start with perhaps a question from Rosie? What is the etiquette on offering guests a fee?
Yes. The etiquette, in my experience, and I can only really go on that, I've had 50 guests on. Many of them have been, pretty high profile. And I think twice I've been asked about a fee. I've said every time, as an independent podcaster, it's not something I'm able to offer, and I've never been rebutted for that reason. But as I say, it was only, it's twice out of 50 times, and that was when I asked via an agency, where I think they always will be asking. I think the simple case is quite often podcasting is seen across the industry as an opportunity to promote something. So if that's what someone's doing, through being on your show, then that's the sort of arrangement you can come to. I think for something like, I know I used to work for a big tech company that ran their own podcast platforms. They did pay guests, I knew, but then again, that's something where they would be expected to have a budget, and also the guests that they had on, they were more sort of there in a talent capacity. and they weren't specifically promoting a project. So I think that's generally how I've navigated that. It would be different for something like a live podcast recording, where it may involve obviously more time and more travel and more of that. But yeah, I think with this, it always has been on an unpaid but basis, with the understanding that it would be heavy on promotion, a lot of exposure, and hopefully it will be monetizable in that sort of promotion perspective.
Okay, just another one. How do you drive listeners to your podcast?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna lie, it's an uphill process. There are lots of different means. Social media is one. Something like Audiograms are apparently 5 times more effective than other social media types to getting people towards your platform. That can be it's great for discovery, but I think that really it is just looking at all the different routes. So another one can be cross platform. If you can team up with another podcaster to do a shout out for each other's podcasts, that's one of the most effective ways of driving people to your podcast, through hearing through another podcast that is on a similar topic they might be interested in. And I think generally actually there's a lot more scope for networking and creating a community within podcasters. That's actually something that through my course I've got a Facebook page for sort of present and past students, so they all sort of shout about each other's podcasts and are able to sort of give a bit more of a boost that way around. I think also something that can be quite good is the algorithms within Apple and Spotify. It used to be all about Apple because that used to account for, but when I started podcasting, this was only 2 years ago, it was about 85 to 90% of my podcast listenership. Spotify has now really got in there, but you can now leave reviews on both Spotify and Apple, and they have their own internal charts. And if you get enough reviews and enough sort of momentum behind your podcast, it will then go in and trend on the podcast charts, which is another discovery means. So basically lots of different routes. The other brilliant one, old fashioned, but is word of mouth. So I know that a lot of the podcasts I've discovered have always been through that. So it's really just, that the only thing you can really control with that is just making great content, getting it out to a few people and hoping that they pass that information on.
Just one final question from Laura Whitcomb is any tips for moving the conversation on without sort of interrupting when you're interviewing someone on a podcast?
Yeah, I think, the nice thing to remember sometimes if you really have got someone where you think they have sort of gone over the topic a bit, is to know that you can cut it down. So maybe that's something to add to your notepad as you go. But no, I think that there are different ways of doing this. It can be useful to have, as Elizabeth Day has, for instance, on her How to Fail podcast, she has a format. So she'll say, she asks her guests to tell them 3 failures. So she can quite politely say, okay, on to your next failure. In the same way that on Desert Island Discs, it can be a process of, okay, here's on to our next disc, or, here's on to the next part of your story. Having something like that, a format, can actually be quite useful as a sort of, medium of politeness. But really, sometimes it does come down to just having the faith that, you've invited this person on, they are interesting for the right reasons, and also knowing that, I think that almost something I've had to learn is listening and being able to let go of the fact I had a question I thought up, and actually just trying to listen to the end of what that person is saying, because I've actually found through experience, listening and actually tuning in and not trying to cut them off or take the conversation in my direction can actually lead for a better and more fulfilling and more novelty-filled conversation.
Thank you so much for a fantastic and really interesting introduction to podcasting. I'm going to hand over to Laura now, who's got a few words to say.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. That's so interesting. I'm a journalist, but I'm also working for a campaign that's just about to launch its own podcast. So you've really spoken to both my sensibilities. So thank you so much. And I'm sure everybody else here found it really interesting and helpful. I'm also a perfect advert for needing to get rid of awful sounds in the background. That's my children going in the bath. I'm very sorry. But what I wanted to say is, for anybody on the call that isn't already a member of Women in Journalism, tonight's event is just one of a fantastic program of these masterclasses and all other types of events, from in conversations with some of the UK's and the world's leading journalists. So please, if you consider joining, we'd be very happy to have you. And anybody that does join tonight would have their fee, the £15 fee that you've paid to sign up tonight, refunded, or it'll be taken off the joining fee, which is around £35 a year. So that's my sales pitch over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Francesca. That was absolutely great. So I think we'll say goodbye because we're a few minutes past time. But thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Great evening.